Hi guys, this is Taylor, and today I am going to count down my top 10 books of the entire decade. I had such a fun time compiling this list, and it really made me realize how excellent this past decade was in terms of the books that were published. So just to clarify what this list is, instead of like a top 10 countdown of the year where I'll count down the top 10 books that I read regardless of the year that they were published, this is a list that is, for me, the top 10 books published between 2010 and 2019. I have also taken into consideration the themes and the topics that these books have. So really I've tried to showcase books that I think are particularly relevant to the time period that they were published in. So without further ado, let's start with the top 10 pick on my top 10 of the 2010s, and I'm going to give this one to 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. Now, when this book was originally published in Japan, it was published in 3 parts, and the first 2 parts were published in 2009, and only the 3rd part was published in 2010. But my argument is that this wasn't published as a complete story until 2010, and that's why I'm counting it towards this decade. 1Q84 begins with a woman stuck in traffic on the highway, and she decides to take the emergency stairs down the side of the highway, and something about this action enters her into a parallel universe, basically. So she is now in 1Q84 instead of 1984. And various plot lines unfold, and we follow multiple people as they try to navigate the experience of 1Q84. So in this edition of the novel, it comes in at about 1,200 pages, which makes it by far the longest novel I've ever read, and where I'm really crediting this book here, and why I think it's one of the top 10 books of the decade, is that during this entire time, it remains fully engaging. It is so dynamic, it just seems to expand and expand, and it's still fully holding your attention the entire time. And I really found myself wanting to spend even more time with these characters, and I'm one who will typically feel like tapping out after about 500 pages or so. With this one, I would definitely look up trigger warnings and content warnings, because as with a lot of Murakami, there is a lot of disturbing content in here. But in looking back over the last decade, this is definitely one of the books that I regard as the most impressive. At number 9 on my list, I am picking Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is really a booktube favorite, and it's one that just genuinely lived up to the hype for me. This is a multiple perspective, post-apocalyptic novel where a pandemic breaks out and very few people are left surviving on Earth, but the people who do survive tend to be a little tribalistic because they have to survive and they have to be a little more cautious about the people around them. And one of these surviving tribes just happens to be a roving caravan of Shakespearean actors. The reason that this is still so impressive to me is because I genuinely think that this is one of the best ever multiple perspective novels I've ever read. For me, I was equally interested in each of the perspectives, which I feel like almost never happens. And I think all of the perspectives fit together really beautifully. And this also had a plot twist that made everything fit together even better and just like shocked me to my core. So that is why Station 11 has really stood the test of time for me. Coming in at number 9, I have Landscape with Invisible Hand by M.T. Anderson. I feel like I am one of the world's biggest advocates for M.T. Anderson at this point, but I also do genuinely think that this is one of the most timely books on this list. Landscape with Invisible Hand is basically about an alien invasion, but the aliens are basically peaceful, except their currency is worth like 1,000,000 times what any human currency is worth. So essentially, unless you are an alien or you have direct ties to an alien, you live in poverty. And I feel like I've said this a million times, but M.T. Anderson just has this incredible ability to tackle really difficult topics with this levity and humor. So this takes a really hard look at capitalism and income inequality, healthcare, access to healthcare, and it does this in such a clever and almost ridiculous way. I really like satire and I really like dark humor. But M.T. Anderson just has his own specific brand of it that is so unique and so specific to him, and I really think that Landscape with Invisible Hand is one of the best examples of it. At number 7, I have 10th of December by George Saunders. George Saunders is my favorite author of short stories, and this is my second favorite collection of his, my favorite that was published this decade. This is one of the books on this list that I read a little longer ago, but I do remember that it covered a really wide array of topics, and I remember feeling like he really did each one of them justice. He is another author who has a very unique personal brand, and he applies that brand to each and every one of his stories and each and every one of his works. This is a collection that I don't really look back on as having very many weak points or like just throwaway filler stories, which is sort of unheard of for me. So for me, I just remember this being a short story collection that delivered punch after punch and that really drove home the fact that George Saunders is my favorite short story writer. Coming in at number 6, I have Sounds Like Titanic by Jessica Chicharito Hindman. This is another book on this list that I bumped up to be a little bit higher because I think that the topics that it deals with are extremely relevant. From the outset, this is a memoir by a violinist who worked and played with this person who she refers to as only the composer. And she toured with this orchestra and she played these huge sold-out shows to these concert halls, but no one was ever really playing their instruments. And the sound that would come over the speakers at these concerts was from a CD player that I think they bought at Walmart. So it's this really intriguing premise, but then the author is also a journalist, and she delves really expertly into these topics that I didn't even expect. The main interrogation of this book is actually whether or not people really want to know the truth, or if we would rather just be fed lies. And it's just so interesting to read about in this context. The author also talks about other things in here. There's a lot about anxiety, and specifically female anxiety, that I found really profound. But mostly I just thought that this had such a good, intriguing premise, and that it pulled exactly the right questions out of this experience. Number 5 is another book that I think is extremely timely, and that is Loner by Teddy Wayne. Loner, I'm just gonna say right off the bat, is a wildly uncomfortable book. We are put into the mindset of a freshman entering Harvard University who has never really felt very included, but who feels that in entering college, this is going to be his fresh start, that this is his chance to get a girlfriend and to elevate himself socially, but he ends up manipulating himself into one of the most uncomfortable social situations I've ever read about. And this really becomes a portrait of how his previous isolation led him to become entitled to women and to their bodies. This is another one that I would look up content warnings for if you're interested, but if you can stomach it, I found it completely worthwhile and actually kind of riveting. At number 4, I have put Severance by Ling Ma. This is another pretty popular one that blew me away just for the sheer fact that it is a debut novel. This is sort of a mid-apocalypse novel where the world is being slowly affected by this almost zombie-like disease, but it doesn't cause you to harm anyone. You basically just keep repeating certain facets of your life over and over again until you die. So a mother might keep repeatedly setting the table until she dies. I would probably keep reorganizing my bookshelves until I died. But basically our main character just decides to keep going to work every day as everyone slowly dies around her. And she keeps this photo blog of New York City as it slowly empties out of people. The thing that continuously blows me away about this one is the writing and how seamlessly everything just blends together. This does jump in time from before the apocalypse to, I guess, what I'm calling the mid-apocalypse, and everything is just written in this like wistful, melancholy haze, yet it's super compelling. It's so sad and just a little hopeful, and it just came across to me as like truly effortless. I adored reading this book. At number 3, I have picked In the Dreamhouse by Carmen Maria Machado. This is her memoir of her trying to navigate an abusive queer relationship, and it applies her very surreal, kind of otherworldly style to the whole narrative. The reason that this book is making my top 10 and really my top 3 of the decade is because, as far as I'm concerned, a book like this, covering this material, is unprecedented. It's even a main focus in the book, that while she was going through this, there was nowhere that she could look to for help. There was no media that she could try to consume to help her navigate through this toxic relationship, or even media of any kind to say, yes, this can really happen in same-sex relationships as well, and that what is happening to you is totally valid. And on top of that, her signature style, this kind of surrealism, just goes so well with the topics that she's describing. It's a perfect match for this particular dynamic in their relationship. It's surreal, it's chaotic, it's sort of suffocating, it's terrifying. It just works perfectly to portray this relationship. This is such a dark, dark book, but I think it's one of the most important books that I've read in a long time, and definitely one of the top of the decade. Coming in at number 2, these last two are not going to be a surprise at all, but I have Shelter by Jung Yoon. This is, I guess, kind of a domestic literary thriller about a second-generation Korean man who has basically assimilated and started his own family. His parents experience a home invasion, and this just sets off a chain of events that causes incredible tensions with his parents and his wife and his kids and almost every single person around him. This book, like especially the top 3 on this list, just absolutely hit me like a ton of bricks. For me, and I'm really stressing the "for me" here because I haven't really heard other people talk about it in this way, but for me, this was such an incredible examination of grief. It made me think a lot about all of the strange and unorthodox ways that grief can manifest. This has become such an important book to me, and the things that I've taken away from it are only a part of it, because this book contains one of the wildest plots I've ever read. I want to say that this is one of the top 2 or 3 most engrossing books I've ever read. So on top of everything that I've taken away from it, this was an absolute joy to read, even if the content is very, very far from joyful. Which brings me to my number 1 of the entire decade, from 2010 to 2019, and it should really be no surprise that that is Brass by Shanae Aliu. This has 2 timelines. We first follow a young girl who becomes pregnant by a married Albanian line cook from the diner where they both work, and then 19 years later we follow their daughter, who has never met her father and who has questions. It's a relatively simple plot, but this book is infamous on my channel because it made me cry harder than I've ever cried at any book, almost harder than I've ever cried at anything. And that is because Brass, more than any other book I've ever read, drives home the fact that poverty creates poverty and how impossible it is to escape poverty. And even if you do, it's because everything lined up perfectly for you. I don't talk about it as much, but Brass also has some really important things to say about the immigrant experience, especially the Albanian immigrant experience, which is something that I knew next to nothing about before I read this book. Basically, this is just a book that I will keep inside me forever. I think about it probably at least once a day, and like a number of books on this list, but especially this one, this genuinely changed my life. So that is that. Those are, after much deliberation, my top 10 books of the entire decade. Of course, let me know if you've read any of these, if you plan to read any of these, and especially let me know what your absolute favorite books of the decade were. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!